Israeli authorities are afraid, fear nothing, for the boundless support from Washington allows Israel to elude responsibility for any crimes. The rapidly deteriorating situation in the West Bank requires a reaction from the Security Council.
We all know the ceasefire deal is the best chance to tackle the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and to address regional stability.
Let us recall that since October 7, the U.S. has cast 5 vetoes to shield its ally and to block the adoption of a clear demand from the Council for a ceasefire.
All parties refrain from actions which could escalate broader regional tensions and undermine the ongoing negotiations.
The one thing that the Americans expect from the Security Council is to exert pressure on Hamas not to get in the way of Israel on the ground, and this despite the fact that the vaunted deal.
A ceasefire in Gaza could reduce tensions along the Blue Line, creating conditions for displaced Lebanese civilians to go home in the south and for Israeli civilians displaced by Hezbollah's persistent rocket attacks since October 7 to return to their homes.
Pressure needs to be exerted not so much on Hamas, but rather on our American colleagues who continue to regard both the Council and multilateral diplomacy as a whole as an unneeded burden.
It is therefore on the shoulders of anyone who wants to see this war end and cares about the plight of Palestinian civilians to press Hamas to engage constructively and close the deal on the table. That is the best way to ensure that the war ends and the region does not go down a darker path in the coming weeks. Colleagues, this is a decisive moment for the parties to the ongoing conflict and for the security of the broader region. The Council will have an opportunity to further discuss the situation with regard to Lebanon tomorrow afternoon. The United States continues to gather facts, and we reiterate that it is not in any party's interest for there to be a broader regional conflict. Indeed, Secretary Blinken continues to work for an immediate ceasefire and hostage release deal consistent with Resolution 2735. As he emphasized yesterday during his visit to Egypt, we all know the ceasefire deal is the best chance to tackle the humanitarian crisis in Gaza and to address regional stability. It is imperative all parties refrain from actions which could escalate broader regional tensions and undermine the ongoing negotiations. We have also called on all parties to the fighting in Gaza to avoid putting civilians at risk and to take important steps to ensure that the humanitarian personnel are able to do their jobs and help save lives. There is no clearer evidence of Hamas's total indifference to Palestinian civilians in Gaza than its continued hiding under civilian sites. For the sake of civilians on all sides of the conflict, this must stop. We must not grow numb to the human suffering in the region. Again, it is manifestly in the interest of Israelis, Palestinians, and every country in the region for the fighting in Gaza to stop and a broader conflict to be averted. As we have emphasized before, a ceasefire in Gaza could reduce tensions along the Blue Line, creating conditions for displaced Lebanese civilians to go home in the south and for Israeli civilians displaced by Hezbollah's persistent rocket attacks since October 7 to return to their homes. Colleagues, as we heard today, the situation in the West Bank also remains of grave concern. We condemn deadly violence against Palestinian civilians by extremist settlers in the West Bank. Moreover, we reiterate Israel would be well advised to avoid military operations and other measures that risk further inflaming tensions and destabilizing the already combustible situation. Israel's program of support for the expansion of settlements is inconsistent with international law and only serves to weaken Israel's security by inflaming tensions and undercutting efforts to achieve a two-state solution. Colleagues, the Security Council can and should play a constructive role consistent with the principles outlined by President Biden in May, and that this Council endorsed in Resolution 2735 to encourage Hamas to accept the deal on the table, to encourage a de-escalation of regional tensions, and to reaffirm to all parties that unilateral measures such as settlements and one-sided resolutions in New York will not bring about a two-state solution. Implementing Resolution 2735 will also require political will from leaders in the region. There is no alternative to a negotiated end to the fighting in Gaza, and there is no alternative path to achieve a two-state solution other than through direct negotiations between the parties. The United States will continue to do everything possible to put forward ideas and proposals to achieve a ceasefire and hostage release in Gaza that would help lay the foundation for a better future for Israelis and Palestinians alike. Colleagues, we see the paths before us. One path would save lives, bring relief to the people of Gaza, bring the hostages home, and de-escalate regional tensions. The other, darker path, which we should all endeavor to avoid going any further down, is marked by further impasses in ceasefire talks, civilian suffering in Gaza, and the risk of additional unilateral actions that could set off a broader conflict. Hamas wants the region to go down the second path, for the fighting and suffering in Gaza to continue, for there to be a broader regional conflict. It is therefore on the shoulders of anyone who wants to see this war end and cares about the plight of Palestinian civilians to press Hamas to engage constructively and close the deal on the table. That is the best way to ensure that the war ends and the region does not go down a darker path in the coming weeks. Thank you, Madam President.
The General Assembly yesterday adopted a genuinely historic resolution reaffirming the advisory opinion of the ICJ, which clearly highlights the unlawful nature of the Israeli occupation of Palestinian lands and the need to put this to an end. We are heartened by the fact that the overwhelming majority of the Council's membership supported this initiative to achieve a just settlement and a long-term resolution to the Palestinian-Israeli conflict and to uphold the right of the Palestinians to establish their own state within the 1967 borders with East Jerusalem as the capital. This result is a clear testament to the fact that the resolution to this issue is long overdue. At the same time, in discussions at the Council on the situation at the OPT for a number of months, thanks to the efforts of our Western colleagues, these discussions have been rather mundane and routine, and this despite the fact that every day dozens and hundreds of Palestinians are dying. In the nearly 1 year of Israeli operations in Gaza, more than 41,000 Palestinians have died. The majority are women and children. At least 100,000 people have been wounded. Tens of thousands are missing persons, and yet Palestinians are dying not just in Gaza. The West Bank, where objectively less attention at the Council is paid attention to, is enduring an equally tragic crisis. More than 600 Palestinians have been killed, more than 5,000 wounded. During the recent Tzahal summer camps operation alone, 39 Palestinians, including 8 children, were killed using drones, artillery, and missiles. They wrought havoc targeting civilian infrastructure. Roads have been destroyed, water and electricity lines destroyed, and administrative buildings have also been destroyed before our very eyes, taking advantage of the Council's paralysis. Thanks to the U.S.'s efforts, the Israeli leadership is seeking and is achieving the objective to expel the West Bank's Palestinian population. Settlement activity has been ratcheted up at a record rate where there's a de facto colonization of Palestinian lands. More and more settler outposts are being established in parallel. Palestinian homes are being demolished in East Jerusalem and Area C. Law enforcement is absolutely indifferent to violence by radically minded settlers against local civilians, and yet none of our Western colleagues have voiced any concern about the erasure of Palestinian identity, even though now we are not even talking just about that. We are talking about the literal erasure of the Palestinian people. They're being wiped out from the face of the earth. Israel is not limiting itself to rendering Gaza uninhabitable. Western Jerusalem is deliberately adopting measures making the lives of Palestinians unbearable in the West Bank too. As Israel continues to withhold Ramallah's clearance revenues, unemployment in the West Bank has reached 40%. The lack of roads and proliferation of Israeli checkpoints means that the staff of agencies located in neighboring cities cannot get to work. The settlers are carrying out raids targeting agricultural sites. As a result of Israeli attacks, 69 schools and 5 universities have been damaged, depriving children and young people of access to education. All of this attests to the West Jerusalem's persistent policy to resolve in addressing the Palestinian issue with the use by creating irreversible effects on the ground, brute force and financial pressure. Israeli authorities fear nothing, for the boundless support from Washington allows Israel to elude responsibility for any crimes. The rapidly deteriorating situation in the West Bank requires a reaction from the Security Council in the same extent, just as the appalling situation in Gaza does. Palestinian civilians are dying there too, and they are losing their homes there too. We all perfectly are aware of the fact that what is taking place is the targeted, deliberate policy of the Israeli authorities, and this can there can be no justification for collective punishment of all Palestinians. However, the Council remains inactive. Unfortunately, its effective efforts on Middle East settlement have continuously been blocked by the U.S., which pushed through a resolution 2735, which is completely unviable, and the U.S. continues to block any attempts to set out a just assessment of Israeli actions, even in the context of the inadmissibility of imperiling the lives and health of UN and humanitarian personnel in Gaza. Let us recall that since October 7, the U.S. has cast 5 vetoes to shield its ally and to block the adoption of a clear demand from the Council for a ceasefire. The one thing that the Americans expect from the Security Council is to exert pressure on Hamas not to get in the way of Israel on the ground, and this despite the fact that the vaunted deal actually has repeatedly been blocked by none other than Israel, for whose benefit the U.S. essentially has been violating Resolution 2735, which did set out parameters for this agreement, even though this was diluted. Colleagues, against the backdrop of the growing demand from the entire international community for a modicum of concrete measures to alleviate and improve the situation in the OPT, the members of the Council simply must summon political will and courage and adopt a decision for a ceasefire in Gaza and measures to enforce compliance therewith. Pressure needs to be exerted not so much on Hamas, but rather on our American colleagues who continue to regard both the Council and multilateral diplomacy as a whole as an unneeded burden. Your hard-headed policy to reject the authority of the Security Council and the UN as a whole not only failed to generate any progress in the context of resolving the current conflict, but it has also caused this conflict to continue for nearly a year, with the risk of this metastasizing into a full-blown regional conflict. There are ongoing attacks along the blue line with Lebanon. The arbitrary airstrikes on Syria are ongoing, as the targeted liquidations on both sides. In this context, we strongly condemn the unprecedented cyber attack on the friendly country of Lebanon and its citizens, which constitutes a gross violation of its sovereignty and constitutes a grave threat to and challenge to international law. We view what transpired as yet another act of hybrid warfare against Lebanon, which caused suffering of thousands entirely innocent people. Against the backdrop of growing tensions in Lebanon and the Israeli border areas, such reckless actions are fraught with highly dangerous consequences, resulting in further destabilization of the military-political situation in the Middle East region. The developments at present and escalation in the south of Lebanon and Israeli airstrikes clearly show the dangerous threshold that the Israeli-Arab conflict has reached. Mr. President, Russia from the very beginning of this crisis has consistently advocated a permanent and comprehensive ceasefire, sustained and secure humanitarian access, the release of all hostages and forcibly detained persons, as well as the relaunch of the peace process on a two-state basis, the result of which would be the establishment of a Palestinian state coexisting in peace and security with Israel in accordance with the approved international legal decisions. And we stand ready to support any constructive initiative from the Council to attain these objectives. We should like to hope that the need for decisive collective measures to halt Israeli operations will become clear to our U.S. colleagues as well. For now, the cost of their hard-headedness and imperialistic ambitions are being paid for with the lives of Palestinian women and children. Thank you.